Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our next panel discussion. We've got a very distinguished group of panelists up here for you for this panel. I'll just start by quickly introducing them. We have Harry Boyd Carpenter, Senior Banker, Power and Energy Utilities for EBRD. We also have Carmelo Scaloni, Executive VP Business Development for EDF Renewable Energy. We have George Pergamalis, Head of Business Development, Africa, Middle East for Enel Green Power. We have Dalia Wahba, Senior Investment Officer, Infrastructure MENA for IFC. And we also have Nancy Rivera, Managing Director, Structured Finance for the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. We've already heard some interesting discussions and presentations today about what's been happening in Egypt over the last 12 months, and I'm sure everyone would agree that it's a very exciting period for the energy sector and project finance in Egypt. It does remain the case, though, that the last IPP to have been successfully financed in Egypt took place in the year 2000. And that was actually two projects that were originally developed by EDF, known as the Gulf of Suez and the Port Said project. And then prior to that, there was the Intergen project, which was awarded and financed a year or two before that. So that was the year 2000, and now we're in the year 2016. And are we going to see, or hopefully we're going to see, a change and that record broken this year. There are actually some interesting parallels between the year 2000 and this year we've just embarked on, 2016. The year 2000 was a leap year. The Olympic Games took place in Sydney, Australia. The European Football Championships took place, and as my friend Carmelo may remember, that was a final that was won by France against Italy. And that year we also had a US presidential election. And then this year in 2016, it's also a leap year. The Olympic Games are taking place later in the year in Rio, and so too are the European Football Championships this summer. And unfortunately, we're all going to be subjected again to another US presidential election later in the year. So I think the stars are all aligned for some renewed activity this year in the Egyptian IPP sector, and I'm anticipating that we're going to see a raft of new IPPs financed this year. And I've got a very distinguished group of panelists with me that hopefully are going to be able to convince us that that's the case. I thought I would start by asking each of the panelists, and maybe I would start with the lenders amongst this group, just generally about what you're doing at the moment in the Egypt energy sector. I appreciate from a lender point of view, you are restrained by confidentiality constraints, and so you may not want to disclose exactly which sponsors or projects you're supporting, but perhaps you can give us a bit of flavour for the size of the projects, the number of the projects, and the nature of the projects that you're currently supporting. So I thought, Harry, if you don't mind, I might start with you.
Our engagement in Egypt started only a few years ago, and our first projects in the power sector have been with the government. So we've done a couple of sovereign loans in the thermal power sector, which we think are important projects, but EBRD's focus has always been the private sector, and we're hoping this year will be the real sort of shift. And I often talk about two transitions going on in the Egyptian energy sector, one physical, one structural. And the physical is obviously the shift from a hydrocarbon domination to growing penetration of renewables, and the structural is the shift from overwhelmingly state-dominated to greater private sector participation. And I think these two are very linked. And hopefully this year is the sort of year in which both of them really start. So I think, I'm sure Nancy and Dalia will say the same. The focus this year will really be on the feed-in tariff program for us. We've publicly announced that we have an allocation of up to $500 million for that program, which certainly means a very busy year if things go according to plan. And the other project in this context that we will look at is Dairut, which, again, I think everybody knows well.
Nancy, would you mind then answering that and just giving a bit of an overview about what OPEC's doing in Egypt at the moment?
Well, OPEC is part of the U.S. government. We are the U.S. government's development bank. So when we made a commitment, we, the U.S. government, made a commitment to Egypt, there was specifically a commitment on OPEC's part to deliver $1 billion in the sectors that the government considered priority, which obviously is the power sector, because there is no economic growth without the ability to meet the electricity demand. So the bulk of the $1 billion we do expect will be in the electricity sector. We have at least 9, if not 10 projects that will be part of the feed-in tariff program. And we also expect to be probably the largest lender to Dairut. And I think that will actually consume the $1 billion of capacity that we have. We, of course, are very happy that there is an opportunity to not only grow the sector, but as Harry said, bring renewed vigor from private sector discipline and practices to the sector, because 15 years, as the last time the private sector was involved, many things have changed in those 15 years.
Thank you, Nancy. And Dalia, I know obviously IFC are very involved in a number of projects in Egypt at the moment, not just in relation to the feed-in tariff program, but also Dairut, and maybe you could fill us in on that.
So I guess for IFC, we've been active in Egypt for quite a long time for now. Given our focus on private sector, probably our last investments in Egypt private power infrastructure was the IPPs, actually, the EDF projects that you mentioned, and after that in one port project. We're looking to re-engage. We have already an outstanding committed portfolio in Egypt of $1 billion in diverse sectors. At the moment, the core focus is on infrastructure across the board. And of course, given the need for power and the importance of power in the mix, a large part of that of our focus is diverted to power. Similar to EBRD and OPEC, we're supporting the feed-in tariff program. We have we're engaged with 13 projects with 10 developer groups, and we're looking to mobilize a large amount of parallel financing for those projects. We're also looking to engage local banks, because we think there needs to be the capacity built in the market for local banks also to participate in those projects to secure the further or future rounds of financing of those projects. But apart from that, we're also focused on the port sector. We just closed an investment in the port sector recently, and we're looking to engage in other sectors.
Thank you, Dalia. Giorgio, maybe if I could just turn to you. I know that Enel, you have, I think, 2 wind projects as part of the feed-in tariff program and 1 solar project. And I was just wondering, could you give us a bit of an update just in terms of what stages you're at with those projects? I'm assuming you've probably by now signed your cost-sharing deed, and the next step is finalization of execution of the PPA. And so maybe if you could just give us a bit of an overview as to how that's going and what your projections are in terms of when you anticipate you'll achieve financial close for your projects. I understand the wind projects may be a bit behind the solar project.
I mean, you got it. You got it. It's exactly like you said. We do have 2 wind and 1 PV program. For the one of the technologies, the cost-sharing deed has been signed. There's a bit of a lag in the other, but we're in constant and very high-level contact with the organizing authorities, not only us, all the developers. The dialogue is going on, and indeed we're hoping to get across that milestone also on that side, and hopefully I wouldn't be able to place it in relation to the Olympic Games or the football matches and all this, but hopefully soon the PPA will be finalized and we'll see its signing somewhere in this year, and then start of construction or permitting and all that. Yes.
Okay.
So the general answer is we are as advanced as one can be in this working stream, and we remain very confident with the feed-in tariff program of Egypt.
Thank you. And Carmelo, would you mind doing the same? I understand that EDF, that you have one solar project as part of the feed-in tariff program, or you'll correct me if I'm wrong?
That's correct. Yes, we have one feed-in tariff project in the program, which is advancing pretty well from a development point of view, technical point of view, and also, let me say, financial point of view. I think I take the opportunity also to thank the Egyptian authorities, because this process has been, as Joshua was saying, quite an exchange of experience between the parties to make the PPA as bankable as possible, and we're almost there. We are confident that we will be there soon. We are just exchanging the last documents. We're not, as everyone will say, we're not alone in this. That is a real collaboration between developers, lenders, and the authorities. And I think the goal is common for everybody, is to have this project financed and construction started, and why not also commissioned by the end of the year. So we are on that. I would just also to remind, probably, is that you're going to ask that later, but there's also life after the feed-in tariff. So there are other projects we are engaged in. The competitive IPP tenders for the 200 megawatt PV, the 250 megawatt wind, the 50 megawatt CSP, and also the 10 times 20 program, which we've been part of. So we are trying to be as much we are trying to differentiate our presence in Egypt as much as possible.
Thanks, Carmelo. I've just realized before I didn't introduce myself, so I'm Richard Keenan. I'm a partner of Chadbourne & Park. We're also advising a number of developers in connection with the Egypt feed-in tariff program. For those of you who don't know much about Chadbourne & Park, we are very active in the renewable energy sector. Some recent achievements of ours in the Middle East include advising a developer last year in connection with 4 PV projects as part of round 1 of Jordan's program. And we advised the Aqualed consortium last year in connection with the DEWA 200 megawatt PV project. Moving on, this question is, I guess, more for the lenders in the group, Harry, Nancy, and Dalia. I would like to ask you how important you think it is that these projects, as part of round 1 of the Egypt feed-in tariff program, the projects as part of the first regulatory period, how important do you think it is to the Egypt's energy program as a whole that we see those projects financed this year before the 28 October deadline? How important do you see the financing of these projects generally to Egypt's program?
Critical. And by critical, I mean these projects in aggregate are billions of dollars. Investors, and maybe actually this is a question for the equity, investors spend lots of time and money preparing these projects. As the cliche goes, time is money. In order for the government to continue to have the lowest possible price in programs, the market needs to feel confident that they can count on a schedule which they have translated a model into an expected return. So credibility in the market, because the program goes on schedule with all of these investors, I think is important, not just for this program, but to continue to bring down cost and continue to attract quality investors for the subsequent rounds.
Yeah, I mean, I think sorry.
Do you want to add to that, Harry?
Yeah, I mean, just if you look at other programs in other countries, and I think particularly the South African renewable program, what it shows you is once you get a machine working, once you get a mechanism works, the outputs, I mean, the results for the procuring authority become better and better, both in terms of price, in terms of speed of execution. But to get to the second, third, fourth step, you need to take the first step, and that's always the hardest. So I think, in a way, the real win out of this first round of feed-in tariff is not going to be 2 gigawatt solar or 2 gigawatt wind at this point. It's going to be that there's a model which then the Egyptian authorities can run at the speed and with the outcomes that they want.
Yeah.
I would just add to that and kind of stress a point raised by Nancy that there has been an absence of private sector participation in infrastructure projects in Egypt in a very long time. And I think if we take since 2009, the only project reaching financial close was the New Cairo wastewater project. So in a way, so power sector definitely, but broader impact. For these projects to reach financial close successfully in the scheduled timeline, I think is imperative for re-engaging the investors definitely and mobilizing the required investors.
I'd like to add something. And so when we as development finance institutions that are really in partnership, because all of these projects, we are financing private sector, but really what we are financing is the partnership between the government and the investors who are coming in to provide a service, a public service to the end consumer. So at the end of the day, our main concern is sustainable development. We want projects that, yes, get done on the schedule, but we want projects that ultimately do yield the expected development impact, which means we need projects that are sustainable. In good times, in bad times, we're in for the long run. We are lending 17, 18-year money, which is why it's critical that we have a robust, and by robust I mean a fair and equitable regime for allocation of risks and rewards, because the long-term success of the program is that it perform properly throughout time.
Thank you, Nancy. Giorgio and Carmelo, maybe I could just ask the same or similar question to you from a developer perspective. I mean, how critical to you has this feed-in tariff for round one been to your decision to invest in Egypt and pursue these projects?
What has been more relevant to us has been really the willingness of the government to introduce renewable massively into the system and to change the energy paradigm of the country, not only when it comes to renewable. So there is such a strong commitment from the current government for boosting the energy program of the country, which of course, when it's seen from the angle of renewable is very interesting, but as a whole, for EDF, we consider a country interesting as a whole. You mentioned that the presence of the group there dates back from 16 years or more. And also, should also mention that Edison, through the gas activity, is very, very active in Egypt. So we look at the country as a whole, and we notice that renewable it's strongly supported by the government. So this has been the key decision. Then, of course, there are different mechanisms to support that. The feed-in tariff is the most visible one and the most attractive one, we can also say. But it's a step needed, and I think this has already been mentioned earlier, to create a critical mass in the country that will allow investors to come and will make repeatedly opportunity for business to appear in the country, which is the case of other markets where they started with similar approach, which now they've developed many megawatts. So it's not a single project, 50 megawatt in our case, that it's a stimulator or attractive to us. It's the perspective to enter into a market that will be delivering much more than that through a mechanism that over time shall be sustainable.
Thank you.
You wouldn't hear from me any different to anybody else. We have 3 projects in the feed-in tariff program, so that gives you 150 megawatt. And we hope that this will be the minority in our presence in Egypt in the end of the day, but it's important that investors get really what promised by the government. I mean, it wasn't anybody to say to any regulatory authority, you got to do auctions or feed-in tariffs, but once you make up your mind, you got to follow through. And I completely would understand the sirens, from the price of the Egyptian BOO or the Moroccan BOO, or I don't know, the South African tariffs, that you may be thinking, well, maybe the Egyptian feed-in tariff is priced just too high. Well, this could be a decision, this could be a debate, but from an investor point of view, retroactive changes of mind are not great. And for companies like EDF, for banks like the one sitting on this panel, for us, there is also the concept of, regulatory arbitrage. I mean, people are thinking where you get a welcoming investment destination. So it's very important for us. We are mindful that things are executed as advertised. And although it's around 150 megawatt, despite the fact that the forthcoming tenders are 200 each, for example, we'd like to see them pursued as intended.
Yeah, thank you. Do you want to add anything to that, Nancy, or anyone? You look like you're about to say something else. No.
Thinking about next.
There's obviously, already today there's been presentations about the number of projects which are currently under procurement in Egypt. The feed-in tariff program alone, I know the government set a target of 2,000 megawatts of solar and 2,000 megawatts of wind. I'm not sure exactly what number of megawatts is currently under procurement. But then in addition to that, tenders were issued last year, additional tenders. I understand there was a tender for a 50 megawatt CSP project, a tender for a 200 megawatt PV project, and a tender for another 250 megawatt wind project. If any of that's inaccurate, I'm sure there are people in this room who can say. And then on top of that, we have the 250 megawatt Gulf of Suez wind project, which the preferred bidder, I understand, is a consortium of Engie and Toyota Soshu. We've already talked about the Beirut project, what's the size of that now? It's about 2,000 megawatts?
It's 2,250 megawatts. Yeah.
All right. And then on top of that, we have these Komombo projects that I'm not sure what stage that's at, but I understand that involves 10, 20 megawatt projects. So it's obviously a lot. Do we think, and again, I guess this is a question more for you lenders, but is there going to be sufficient liquidity in the international, regional, and local debt markets to finance all these projects? I know it's a very general question, but does anyone want to take a stab at that?
The blunt answer would be not necessarily, depending on if all the projects come to the market in the next 12 months, and if it remains to be just the DFIs, then I don't think we will be able to meet the financing needs for all those projects. This being said, then the current environment is making it quite challenging for mobilizing commercial banks into the country. So I guess we're doing our best. We're looking to support the different initiatives and projects, but we will come to a point where we will have limitations on how much we can do.
So I will be more stark. The answer is absolutely not enough capacity. I think the South Africa story is a very interesting one because they actually do not have indexation in their tariff, and they decided that they were going to create internal liquidity in their market to be able to satisfy their infrastructure needs. And the way they went about it was creating a very, very tight international best practices risk allocation in their contracts, which allowed the commercial banks to meet the needs of the program, which I think it's now over 4,000 megawatts. So this is part of what is missing, the link that is missing here. The selling of this program and its positive attributes to the international commercial market. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks, Nancy.
If I can add something to that, I mean, totally agree. I mean, in the equation, there must be room for Egyptian banks. That's the case everywhere else in the world. That there is not a single country which is only basing such a massive program on multilateral lenders. There's no way for the ambition, for the size of the game. Another, South Africa is a good example, actually. I think also Brazil is a good one. It's another more contribution to the discussion where the model was to bring into the equation also the government itself through the National Bank for Development, which is part of the structure for financing projects in the country. So if the country is so committed, probably should find a way to involve, engage more the local banks, commercial banks, but also local banks supporting the infrastructure investment that will come.
Can I add something?
Sure.
The international best practices are really important in being a solid pillar for attracting the commercial markets. I'll give you an example. There are many commercial banks that are in this business, but there are less commercial banks in this business than commercial banks that are in the business. So it's a small club. It's not very large and deep. They are looking for some very specific things. Many times, these commercial lenders who can actually deploy large amounts and tenors need things like political risk insurance coverage, because they are prepared to take the credit commercial risks, but they are not necessarily prepared to take the political risks. And you know, it's the traditional trinity of political risks that the market is prepared to offer under certain terms: inconvertibility, transferability, terrorism, expropriation, and the like. So in order to attract these deeper pockets of money, because we're not only talking about electricity now, we're talking about roads and logistics and water and desalination, billions and billions of dollars. This risk allocation, international arbitration, for example, is critical. You cannot get political risk insurance coverage if you do not have a very standard provision for international arbitration. So in order to unlock the maximum amount of resources to really make your PPP program effective, things like international arbitration become important for that next level, for that deeper pocket of funds, because at the end of the day, the DFI money is very small compared to what that market has available for Egypt.
Thanks, Nancy. You've actually covered two of my next topics, which were convertibility risk and local arbitration. And I think you've covered that very well. I don't know whether Dalia or Harry, can you add anything to? I mean, presumably those two issues are still issues that some resolution is required of, or I mean, and I understand some steps are being taken towards that.
I mean, I think they're probably the two sort of crunchy issues. I mean, Carmelo said earlier how collaborative and open the process has been. I think I'd really echo that. I think it's been a privilege to be involved. Frankly, I've never seen, you know, government agencies who are always the people most under pressure in these situations. Never seen them work so effectively and openly with people like us and with developers. So I think as a result of that, I think it's reasonable to say we're very, very close to a PPA that we can all feel comfortable with. Guess what? Those two issues are still out there. On the arbitration one, as Nancy said, I mean, there's a critical issue of matching expectations. You know, you can have the best drafted contract in the world, but the only people who are going to benefit are if the arbitration clause or the dispute resolution clause isn't robust, is people like you, Richard. So it's a live issue. I don't want to say very much more now. I'm confident we'll get there. Convertibility is in a way more, I think, a broader issue because it's not specific to one contract. It's not specific to one sector. I mean, it's a macroeconomic Egypt issue. I think it's the single biggest issue with the program. I think you mentioned before that, and others have commented. I mean, the shortage of commercial debt capital. That is not entirely, but at least partially driven by convertibility concerns. I don't think that, as I said, that is not something that can easily be solved just for one sector, or certainly not in one contract. All I can say is, you know, we continue to worry about it, to work on it, to talk to the government about it. But in that sense, we're just one small part of a very large jigsaw. I mean, everybody involved in Egypt, everybody investing in Egypt, trading in Egypt, doing business in Egypt is affected by that issue.
Thanks, Harry. Dalia, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No,
Probably covered
I
it.
don't think on this one.
A question's come in and was actually going to be my next question. And maybe to Harry or you, Dalia, I mean, presumably at the moment you've been sounding out the appetite amongst international and regional banks who may come in and participate in your B loan structures. What sort of appetite are you seeing at the moment amongst the international and regional banks for maybe start with the focus on the Egypt feed-in tariff program?
I'd say very limited. So we're seeing very limited appetite from the banks. Risks flagged, of course, include highly the convertibility. But then again, I would say it's been a while since banks have been lending longer tenors in Egypt. So the convertibility risk is not making it any easier. And again, you could mobilize with, for example, the likes of ECA covers, but given the nature, for example, on the solar side, there's a limited number of relevant ECAs that can come into play. So that's, again, is not allowing much participation from commercial banks. So far, we have to say it's looking more like a pure DFI play. The only confirmed interest that we're looking into is to mobilize is local banks, because there's ample liquidity in the market and there's appetite to engage on those projects and find a way to get to participate and fund them.
Do you think the participation of international and regional banks is going to be dependent on ECA coverage?
Very much so.
For the moment. I mean, I think also you can discriminate between projects that have a tariff paid in dollars as opposed to a tariff paid in EGP. I think there's more. I mean, there are a number of things. To go back to your question, I mean, Dalia is more charming than I am because where she has very little interest, I have zero interest from commercial banks. You know, you just can't get them engaged in these projects at the moment. Why is that? I think it's a number of things. One is just general. You know, project finance is not attractive for banks in the current regulatory environment. They're capital constrained, the capital costs of project finance are high, the rewards don't justify it. So that's not an Egypt problem, that's a sort of generic problem. Then you have a specific concern, you know, Egypt is still an emerging market, still a challenging market. And then you have specifically convertibility for the feed-in tariff program. So these things pile up. I think there's more chance of getting commercial banks involved in projects with dollar-paid tariffs. But even then, very tricky. And you know, probably without ECA cover, we still don't see it.
Yeah, tenor is a big issue at the moment, not just in Egypt. From what I'm seeing amongst the international banks, there seems to be almost a divide at the moment between some of the Japanese commercial banks who still seem to have a healthy appetite for long-term debt, and some of the regional and European international banks would prefer to lend into shorter tenor structures. Has there or is there likely to be any discussion about shorter tenors and soft mini-perm structures, do you think, in the context of Egypt?
Yeah, we've tried that as well. I mean, in a current situation with pretty constrained liquidity, I mean, I think sponsors are open to different structures, different sorts of risk, and certainly we're very, I mean, I think both Dalia and I would say, one of our top priorities is to mobilize commercial finance. It's our biggest, our biggest concern about what does this program mean for Egypt is probably that it's not, in some ways it's nice for us, there's lots to do, but actually it's not a comfortable situation to finance an entire program off the back of DFIs whose capacity is inevitably constrained. So I think we would all be delighted to find a way to mobilize. So we've been, actively talking about semi-perms, mini-perms, soft perms, all sorts of styles.
But I mean, this is why I go back to the fact that our job is really to not be needed. And the quicker we can attract, charm, persuade the commercial banks to come in, it's going to be a better situation for that long-term infrastructure program that you so very much need, which goes back to the most basic of things that we're kind of dancing around, right? The better, the tighter those contracts are, the quicker that you will be able to actually get that huge pot of money from the commercial banks. The banks, we work all over the world. We are not limited geographically, just like the IFC is. And our experience tells us that it's a herd mentality for sure. We go in and we do the first deals. It may take 3 years, it may take 4 years, it may take 5 years. It depends on the market. I think actually Jordan is an interesting example because when we started working in Jordan, going back 10 years in the first IPP that they did, there was nobody that was interested in lending other than a DFI. Jordan right now has a very attractive program and they are capable of bringing in people from the commercial markets. Maybe it's just from the region, but that's a huge success in my mind. So the robustness of these contracts right now, it's not a conversation between government and DFIs. It's a combination between government and us as a proxy for the next round of lenders that you will need for your country.
Thanks, Nancy. I know we're out of time. Can I just, there's one question from the audience, which I think is probably worth asking. This question is, with regards to the FIT program in Egypt, I believe IFC and EBRD have reached their capacity. Is there a chance of additional funding or perhaps freeing up some of the existing committed funds due to inability to reach financial close? So I guess the question is if...
Everyone is reaching financial close.
Yeah, sorry. The question is obviously if there's a particular sponsor that doesn't get there, will that free up some funds for another sponsor potentially?
I mean, it could possibly, but then again, it will be the timing. If this happens in the next few weeks, then there will be enough time, but then it happens in the summer. I don't think it would help anyone to start engaging for a couple of months. But unfortunately, it is the case that we've reached our maximum capacities at this point in time, and that's back to Nancy's point. I mean, this is why there needs to be the mobilization of commercial banks.
Okay, well, look, we could go on. We've got a really interesting panel here, but I guess we've run out of time. So I'd just like to finish by asking you all to please thank the panelists very much.